All right, guys, we are going to start chapter 19 and chapter 20. I'm still working on my assessments and figuring out how I want to test you guys over chapter 18, so don't throw away those notes just yet. But chapters 19 and 20, this is my favorite section in history, so hopefully my enthusiasm will be oozing off of your computers, off your computer screens. So, Truman to Eisenhower, these presidents cover from basically 1945 to 1961. So, we're pretty much covering the tail end of the 40s and getting into the 1950s. So, here we go. Post war America. World War II is over. Our country is thriving. We just defeated the German war machine, and we also defeated the Japanese. We got our revenge for Pearl Harbor. We got our revenge for the Bataan Death March, and we are on the top of the world. We had something similar to this post the War of 1812. We had something similar to this post World War I, where we just had a time when America was growing. And when you think about the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, the 50s are going to be very, very similar to that. In post-war America, you did have a lot of soldiers coming home. I think this is kind of one of those, looks kind of cheesy, the guy coming home, obviously a photo op more than anything, but this guy coming home to his wife, and the soldiers are coming home. And the soldiers are coming home and looking for jobs as quick as they possibly can to get back to some normalcy. And we had millions and millions of men that are coming back to look for jobs. We also have millions of women that are actually going to be going back home to be homemakers again, as many viewed that was their rightful role. And during this time, you had what people starting families, and they called this the baby boom generation. From people born from around 1945 to 1960, baby boomers. And those individuals that were born during this time were mainly because we had a lot of people that weren't having children during World War II. But once World War II was over, these people were coming home and they were starting families and they were having kids, and it led to a huge baby boom. This is a picture from a Saturday Evening Post, and you see the picture of the dad here looking shocked, and the nurse holding the baby. This is the old school. They don't really do this too much anymore. You can see the new dad look. He's obviously a new dad. I've had that look myself on occasion. But this was part of that. And the baby boom generation, this is generally, we would say, probably your grandparents' time period. And we had a ton of kids that were born during that time. We also had an idea called demobilization. This is reducing the size of an army. You know, it was coming to realization that there was no need for us to have a huge army anymore, a huge military. There wasn't any wars, active wars that were going on, so they wanted to kind of slow things down. And demobilization was that idea of getting rid of a lot of the guns and the tanks and the airplanes that you didn't need, the soldiers that you didn't need at that point in time. So demobilization was another thought and theory that they were trying to push in post-World War II America. As far as unions, we've talked frequently about unions and how unions really want two different things, maybe three different things. They generally want better hours. They want better pay. Working conditions is something that they're always pushing for. And when they were coming back from war and they were going back to their jobs, some of these individuals went on strike because they were losing jobs to these military guys coming home. And that created some tension. But again, you got to remember, you know, what are these jobs supposed to do? Are they supposed to just give the military guy their job back or fire the guy that worked during the time that the military was gone? It puts them in a tough spot. And so they did go on strike because of jobs and money, but Truman stepped in, and Truman had a phrase, the buck stops here, and basically meaning what I say goes. And his solution to a lot of these problems when people went on strike was this. Well, I'm going to draft workers, meaning I'm going to draft them myself, and just like we do a military, we'll get people to go back to work, or we're going to give soldiers your job back if you aren't satisfied with your pay. Basically what he was saying is, get to work, and I'm not going to put up with any of your lack of willingness to work with our country and work with our economy. We need you to get back to work, and if you don't find a solution, then I will. Is a picture of President Truman. You can see probably a weekly radio address. Does look like a friendly guy, but he was pretty fierce. The Taft-Hartley Act, this hurt the rights of the unions. itself, mainly because it said that you could not go on sympathy strikes. Here's what a sympathy strike is. Let's say that I am a coal miner and I'm going on strike because my coal mine isn't paying me what I believe I deserve to be paid. And Parker works for he works for an iron company. Well, I would go on strike as the coal worker to say that I need more money. And as a result, Parker, my buddy, would go on a sympathy strike, and him and his workers that worked in the iron mills, they would also go on strike to show their solidarity with me. And so, again, this said that you could not go on sympathy strikes, basically meaning you as a worker had to stay at work if it only applied to your job. If you wanted to go on strike for you, that's fine, but you can't go on strike for other workers. No sympathy strikes. Political changes. We did have a Republican Congress. Now, this was a big change because if you're thinking back in your history, we've had a Democratic president since 1933, and at this point in time, 1945, we finally get a Republican Congress, which is going to take a different turn when it comes to passing policies. And one of the things that they had to find themselves fighting with was President Truman's domestic plan called the Fair Deal. Now, this was his domestic plan, the Fair Deal. I would make sure you know that. And his threefold part of his Fair Deal was to create jobs for people, to end job discrimination itself, meaning African Americans could have rights to work, women could have rights to work, and then also to help build housing for people coming home from World War II. And he called this a fair deal because he wanted a fair deal for all people. You might be like, it sounds similar to the Square Deal with Teddy Roosevelt. Correct. A lot of these guys are going to base these on some of the same philosophies. Why? Because it's always popular to say we need to create jobs. They would say it's always popular to end job discrimination, well, with most people, and then build housing. You really can't go wrong, so of course this is his domestic plan. And you can see this is a coal miner workers at a poster that they had. All we want is a fair deal. So again, trying to look after the everyday worker. So that leads to the election of 1948, in which Harry Truman is going to run, and he's going to run against Thomas Dewey, who's a Republican. And a lot of people actually thought that the Republicans had a chance. So let me ask you this before we move forward. Why would we think that the Republicans would have a chance at winning this election? I'm giving you time to answer in your head, and here we go. The main reason would be because the Democrats had dominated for so long, the war was over, not a lot of people really loved Truman's kind of in-your-face type demeanor. And so a lot of people were thinking maybe we could get a Republican candidate finally in there. And so when they decided to have this election, Thomas Dewey actually has a pretty good shot here. There was a guy named Strom Thurmond who is actually going to run for a party called the Dixiecrats, Dixie meaning the Southerners, so kind of like a Democratic Southerner. And he actually is running on a party that wants segregation, meaning wants blacks and whites to continue to stay separate. And so Strom Thurmond is going to be part of that Dixiecrat party, and he wants segregation badly. Now, here's what the picture of this looked like. You can kind of see this electoral college map, and Thurmond, pretty much like we would guess, is going to win the southern states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and 1 vote in Tennessee. Dewey is going to win in the Northeast and part of the Midwest, and Truman's going to win most of the rest of the country. Now, if you look at this, these electoral votes, notice how Florida only has 8. Not a lot of people are living in Florida. California only has 25, so people are not moving out there. But a lot of people, even on the exit polls, really felt like Truman was going to be defeated by Dewey. And the result, people thought Dewey would win, but Truman was a surprise winner. And that kind of goes to this amazing political picture. This is a super historical photo, and it says the Chicago Daily Tribune, Dewey defeats Truman. GOP, that means Grand Old Party, or the Republicans, sweep indicated in state. And this headline is one that probably made Harry Truman very, very happy, as you can see here. And the newspaper went to press before all the returns were counted. And the people that helped Truman retained office were African Americans, Union members, farmers, all helped Truman stay in office. And this definitely made the Chicago Daily Tribune look pretty silly. And obviously, Harry Truman thought that was quite funny as well. But again, let's go back to this and look at the number of the electoral votes. And it was a close election, but Truman was able to win, and he's going to be president for the next 4 years. So let's move on to Roman numeral 2, the Cold War. We'll just start on this. And the Cold War, the description of the Cold War, you guys have probably heard of this term before. This is not a direct confrontation. There's no real fighting. It's more of a war of words, threats, and policies. And the Cold War defines America and Russia from 1945 to 1990. And the Cold War just pinned us against the Russians for that 45-year period. And it was a big deal. This is why, if you guys have heard of the Miracle on Ice, that's why that hockey game in 1980 at Lake Placid, New York, which if you get a chance, there's an advertisement over the break. You should watch Miracle. It's on the Disney Plus, I'm sure. But you should watch that. It talks a little bit about the tension that Americans and the Russians had. This is why if you watch Rocky IV, when he fights the big Russian, that's why it was a big deal. It was us versus the Russians. And this is also why, if you guys have watched Stranger Things, it's us versus the Russians, because during the 1980s, it became a huge, huge issue. But we never actually went to war. But we definitely lied to each other. We had spies in both countries trying to figure out what everybody was doing. And it faced us versus the Russians from 1945 to 1990. Is a picture of the American flag and the Russian flag. And a lot of this was found in a location, Eastern Europe. Russia was turning much of Eastern Europe into satellite nations. Now, that seems kind of weird because you might be like, what kind of satellites did they have in the 1940s? Well, the satellites that we're talking about is this. It is a nation controlled by another. So it would basically be like America controlling Canada. We tell Canada what to do and they just do it. But they're still technically Canada. And so they created, sometimes we call this a puppet nation. But they created satellite nations and they controlled all of these other nations, all in Eastern Europe. And we were a little bit too intimidated to go over there and boss them around because we didn't want to go to war with Russia. And so a lot of this is founded in the Cold War, where you start getting into these satellite nations and they're just controlling one another, one after another after another. And Russia is making Eastern Europe look more like them, more communistic every single year as we get closer and closer to the 1990s. So we'll stop there. That'll be it for today. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about the Cold War, and we will actually get into the speech by Winston Churchill, the Iron Curtain speech. So hopefully that helps you guys understand that.